Good evening all, and welcome. There are many people out there who have criminal intentions, and if you wind up with them, you could find yourself in a sticky situation, as these people did. So for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. We were a bunch of naive kids traveling abroad in 1992, and our 2-week beach vacation turned into 2 nights of horror. Ever since our sophomore year, my high school gang of friends dreamed and planned for an epic trip to Cancun in Mexico. One of us saw a movie and thought it would be an amazing destination for us to escape the New England winter and celebrate surviving the high school experience. There were 6 of us on the plan. Keith, our unofficial leader, lost his dad his junior year, and so this trip became our way of keeping him thinking ahead to something good. Greg and Kirk were big history and archaeology buffs, so they were as interested in the Mayan ruins as the beach and beer. Dorothy and Hannah were gamer girls, a rare thing in my area, and were up for a trip to the beach with their big brothers, and I was just looking forward to an adventure. Unfortunately, we couldn't go the year we graduated. Some of us had to put our savings towards college or other experiences, and 2 of us got jobs that wouldn't allow the time off. Despite this, we had a pact to make it happen. A year passed, then another. It was 5 years before Keith phoned us to say he had booked not just a room or suite for us, but an entire house on the beach for 2 weeks. 5 of us were back in our hometown for the holidays, and we met up at a bar and had a great reunion. And Keith showed us the brochure he received from the travel company. The place was gorgeous, almost gaudy in its gold trimmings and ritzy amenities. Clearly the house was going to be expensive, even split 6 ways. But it wasn't. In fact, it was a bargain for 2 weeks. What's wrong with it? That was Kirk's question. But we all were thinking it. Keith explained that it's the hurricane that swept through and had depressed the local economy, so these outlying properties were booking to try and keep up with the more prosperous city of Cancun. The house was nearer the village of Puerto Juarez, but near all the same attractions as Tulum and Ixmal. And we could go to any beach we wanted, take a boat trip to Isla Mujeres or even Belize if we wanted to, for a third of our original estimate. We tentatively agreed because we knew Keith vetted the place before committing to it. He had already put down the deposit and set the weeks based on the hold, and we all put it in the calendar. It was late in the season of the following year. The truth was that we were all getting older and moving on. Some of us were in relationships and planning for weddings. Greg already had a baby on the way with his fiancée, so time was running out on our childhood dream before we would part ways for good. Fast forward 9 months and the day arrived. I had digested travel guides and had everything I needed. I took the cheapest flight, which meant layovers and switching gates, so I arrived later in the afternoon. I happened to meet Dorothy at the baggage claim. We remarked how grown up we both looked, shared a few hugs, and agreed to share a cab to our vacation villa. We waited in a long line to be married up with one of the taxis lining the arrival area, caught up on the latest gossip and life events, and entered vacation mode. Dorothy was getting married in the spring and moving to Europe. Hannah had to back out at the last minute because of work, but sent her love. When it was our turn, we were paired with this old, rusty bucket of Chevy steel driven by an older man who swept us up with the grace of a ballroom dancer and the smile of a car salesman looking to make quota. His name was Paulo, and he wasted no movement getting our bags into the trunk and us in the back seat. "Where do we go?" I gave him the address, and he looked at me in the rearview mirror. "Eh?" I repeated, and he nodded, still somehow confused. After reporting to someone on the radio and including the address twice, It sounded like even the dispatcher was confused. He switched turn signals and began to merge right against the flow of traffic, exiting the airport towards the city. He quoted us a price and I agreed. We headed down an empty lane into the growing shadow of dusk while most folks were heading into the bright lights of Cancun. The road was 2 lanes and covered with litter. Shortly beyond the on-ramp, we passed a tent city crowded with people and torches being lit to illuminate families living in squalor. Toddlers and children without clothes sat in the dirt and under makeshift tent homes. Further down the road, beached vessels lay on their sides, sunken into the sand or soil. Families with the means had converted them into homes by cutting holes in the hull to make doorways and windows. Stray, skinny dogs and cats patrolled the roads for food, stopping to glare as we drove slowly past. There were few people on the road in the growing darkness. We had moved into the long shadow of the Yucatan rainforest, on a road following the beach. The ocean was dazzling in the early evening, and Dorothy focused on that while I kept an eye inland. Paolo, too, wasn't as cheerful or talkative once he knew where we were going. "You know people in Puerto Juarez?" he said. I shook my head. "No, a friend rented a house." "Rented a house?" He nodded, pretending to understand but remained skeptical. "It's a very dangerous place. You must be very careful." Dorothy stiffened in her seat a bit. We had entered the forest just a bit, which obscured her view of the beach. She looked at me as if to ask, what did we get into? A mile more down the road, we emerged from the trees to again drive along the beach, inland. Bright, jaundiced security lights bathed a strip mall which included a market and a few odd shops. The only market was opened and housed half a dozen or so taxis with drivers enjoying beers and sodas in the parking lot. Paolo honked and waved as we passed the men that cheered. He smiled, and the presence of pleasant people relaxed us a bit, but his smile faded as soon as we went around the corner. Another half-mile or so and the road was dark. In the headlights, we made out some figures in the distance standing in the road. A few teenagers were standing in the road. A couple held flashlights and all of them carried heavy sticks, and Paolo began to slow down. "Gang of kids," Paolo said. "They want to collect the toll." Dorothy grabbed my arm. I had heard about something like this. "How much?" Paolo shook his head. "We no stop." He accelerated towards the kids on the road, and at the last moment, they dove for the shoulders as the taxi roared through. Dorothy dove into my lap, and we ducked down as the back of the taxi was pelted with rocks. We continued on. Paolo got on the radio and reported it, then mumbled to himself, perhaps regretting getting this fare. We arrived at the address shortly after. Despite the photographs emphasizing the dazzling facade and gardens, the exterior of the property was wrapped in a 20-foot wall of concrete, clocks topped with layers of clumpy cement into which hundreds of jagged bottle pieces were mounted in place of what might have been barbed or razor wire. The driveway was blocked by a tall steel gate and an intercom. Paolo had to buzz in. The gate whined and scraped open against the corrosion and lack of lubrication, taking forever to open wide enough for us to enter. All the while, Paolo and I kept watch on the darkness for sign of those kids on the road. As soon as we got into the property, Paolo kept insisting that they close the gate, as he pulled under an overhang at the door. Fortunately, the gate began to close itself. The front door opened, and our 3 buzzed dude bros poured out onto the driveway. They firemen handled our luggage into the house, and we all began to hug and laugh. Paolo kept watch on the gate, distracted as Keith asked him about the possibility of driving them to Chichen Itza the next morning. Late, of course, so that they could sleep in and have breakfast. Once the gate was closed, Paolo was himself again. Sure, he would be happy to take 3, maybe 4 in his taxi. It would take an all-day trip and he quoted the price. Keith agreed and Paolo prepared to head out. You keep the place tight so the bedbugs no bite. I come back 9 tomorrow. Keith let the warning slip over his head. It occurred to me that he, Greg and Kirk got there during the day, so they most likely had a much more positive experience than we did. Paolo waited outside the gate to make sure it closed before driving off. I also noticed he was returning to town with a wingman in a taxi, who turned around on the road to hail him. The house had been carefully photographed to avoid capturing ugly concrete walls. Some of the walls looked to have been recently rebuilt, and the older blocks had holes in the interior that were patched up with cement. We went inside where the guys had already started playing D&D and drinking. The interior of the house exceeded the grandeur alleged by the photos. The place had a sunken living room with comfortable sofas and chairs, a spiral staircase up to the sleeping level, and a massive dining area with a chef's kitchen attached. We got the quick tour of the place, but Dorothy and I were both exhausted from a day of travel, capped by the ride from the airport. We both had cervezas from the fridge, noting that the pantry had been stocked by the owner prior to our arrival. Keith had already cooked dinner, but we were able to feed off the remaining fajitas and bowls of junk food on the gaming table. I didn't want to roll up a character so late in the evening, but I hung out at the table with my friends, happy to listen to the pattern of our gaming once again. We were all older, spoke a little slower, and thoughtfully, but it was like being home. One of the things I noticed about the house was that it didn't look out onto the beach, at least not directly. The tall concrete wall blocked the view from our first floor patio. The pool was lit from inside, casting the yard in a peaceful blue glow. Linking the property to the beach was another tall steel security gate, through which I could make out a narrow sliver through the light of the rising crescent moon. This made sense in a way. Under Mexican law, all beaches were public spaces. The property line ended at the wall. My thought was interrupted by something Keith said. The phone doesn't work. What? Yeah, we were tired, so we were going to call for a taxi to take us into town to a restaurant, but the phone doesn't work. I felt a little nervous about that. None of us had cell phones. Keith, however, didn't seem bothered. The owner's great. He lives in Puerto Juarez. I'll get in touch with him after we get back from the pyramids tomorrow night. Dorothy and I hadn't planned to take the long trip to the pyramids. We both planned to ease into the vacation by taking a trip to the beach and getting tanned. I wasn't comfortable spending the entire day without a lifeline. It wasn't an insurmountable problem as I started working out ways to maybe take a cab into Puerto Juarez in the morning for Keith and see if I could fix the problem. A loud buzzer sounded and all of us jumped. The same echoed through the entire main floor like a game show buzzer sounding at the incorrect answer, except for longer. As soon as it stopped, it buzzed again. Keith rose from his chair and walked over to a small alcove, presumably to open the gate. Don't open the gate, Dorothy and I said in a duet. Kirk and Greg laughed. Keith stopped and shot us an odd look as the buzzer sounded yet again. I'm not. He opened a panel in the alcove that contained a small security monitor and intercom. He squinted to see what was on the monitor. I stood up and walked over. As I did, Keith muttered, "Bunch of kids." One kid was mugging for the camera and crushing the buzzer. It was a fuzzy image, but the fisheye lens and the security light gave us a look of about 10 people, not just kids, but men, women, and a few dogs milling around them. The one gazing into the camera wanted to be seen. It might have been the lateness of the hour or my own paranoia, but I recognized him as one of the kids blocking the road on our way to the house. Ignore them, I suggested. The buzzer went off and everyone got annoyed. Dorothy put her face in her hands. It bothered her more than the rest for some reason. Can you kill that buzzer? I dunno, Keith shrugged. He searched the intercom and hit the power button. The buzzer ended abruptly. It seemed as though the kid mashing the button knew this because he immediately stopped and stepped back from the panel. He glared at the camera, the light washing out all his features except his eyes full of mischief and a little anger. The group huddled together in the small groups, backs turned to the camera. Keith, unnerved by this, flipped the power back on and pushed the talk button. I didn't have time to say anything against this. "Hey, what can we do for you guys?" The group laughed so hard we could hear them inside the house. The kid stepped up to the intercom again, pressed the talk button and said something in Spanish that I barely made out to mean he wanted food and booze and maybe to come inside and party with us. In English, he added, "We can bring in women and some ganja. Have a real good time, see?" We all looked at one another, not to discuss the proposal, but the ridiculousness of it. "Sorry, we're all partied out," Keith said, thinking of calling it a night. The gang outside talked amongst themselves for a bit. The spokesperson considered this and then hit the talk button again. "No, I don't think you'll sleep tonight." And the group ran off in different directions, and the spokeskid grinning wide as he glared into the camera and backed away. He left the camera heading around the exterior wall. Dorothy stood up and went looking for something that turned out to be a bottle of tequila. She was shaking. Greg went to talk to her because they had always been close. I had learnt later that Dorothy and her fiancé were victims of a home invasion 6 months ago in Baltimore. They were tied up and robbed at gunpoint in the middle of the night. This was a massive trigger for her. "We need eyes upstairs," Keith said. "Someone needs to be able to see over the wall. I have security cameras here and there beachside." Kirk and I looked at the spiral stairs up the landing. Keith called up, "Keep the lights off." We did. I went to a beachside bedroom and peered out the sliding glass door to the balcony. There was no window overlooking the side of the house. They were probably clinging to the wall to avoid to be seen. I sat on the king-size bed and quickly decided that that was a bad idea because I immediately felt sleepy, despite the adrenaline of being put under siege, and I stood up. Just then, a volley of stones rose from behind the wall. A dozen or more softball and golf ball-sized stones caught in the light of the pool area, smashing down on the sand and concrete. Some made it to the balcony, bouncing off the metal railings before rolling into the pool. The crackling stones sounded like gunfire, and Dorothy screamed from the other room. Immediately, the backyard and beach were flooded with white light from the towers erected at the corners of the property. The jagged glass atop the walls sparkled, and I could see shadows cast towards the surf and the top of the heads as small groups stepped back and launched another volley of stones. Some aimed at the lights, while others came soaring at the patio window. None of the rocks aimed at the building reached the windows, they bounced off the railing or the patio overhang. The rocks aimed at the lights just bounced off without effect. Kirk called my name from the front of the house, and I rushed out of the room, down the hall, and into a smaller bedroom where he was pointing out to the front wall. Someone had thrown a heavy blanket up over the top of the wall, a thick one, like one of the moving blankets they rent at U-Haul. He made out the top of a ladder. I looked around for whatever reason and picked up the old radio clock beside the twin bed. I yanked the cord out, wrapped it around the clock, and Kirk gave me the look he gives when I do something stupid or pointless in our weekly D&D game. It wasn't until I got outside on the patio that my conscious brain caught up with what I was going to do. Just as a man's head peeked over the wall, I launched the clock as hard as I could like a frisbee across the yard, the 30 feet or so in his direction. It flew low to one side, but shattered when it hit the glass and concrete, showering the man in shrapnel. It hurt, and startled him enough that he slipped off the ladder out of sight. He landed with a crash and a painful cry. The floodlights burst to life in the front of the house, lighting up the road beyond. A handful of frightened kids scattered carrying their friend who looked really hurt. The sound of stones hitting the house continued out back, and there was shouting. Kirk ran back to where Dorothy and Greg were huddled together in the bedroom, and I heard him shout, "Make sure they're not scaling the walls out back or charging the gate." Convinced they had abandoned their charge on the front wall, I returned to the rear bedroom and gathered the white stones that had ended up on the patio. Plumes of white smoke rose from outside the walls, curling in the security lights. Some more rocks flew into the yard, but they were all weak hurls landing into the pool with no effect. With about 8 stones in my arms, I returned to the main floor. Keith was at the alcove switching between 3 monitors and a black screen. "They got one of the side cameras," he said. "What are they burning?" "I think they're burning the beach furniture." Half of them ran off. The other ones are back, and the older ones, and someone started launching Roman candles at the house from the beach. Dorothy began screaming as the fireball struck the overhang and sliding glass door. Bottle rockets followed, along with an assortment of small explosives. A couple of quarter sticks landed just inside the wall, and the concussive power rattled the windows. One destroyed a deck chair and turned the small flower garden into a crater. Then it stopped. The security light remained on for 5 minutes until a lack of motion reset the compound in darkness. We had to adjust, and it was a frightening moment as Keith scanned the security cameras for a long while. There were no signs of them. Kirk suggested they run up the road or beach, but then the kid from the monitor walked up to the front gate again, a big grin on his face, and was carrying a handgun, displayed clearly for us to see on the monitor. He shook the camera and pushed the talk button. "No, I don't think you're gonna sleep tonight." He spit on the camera and walked away. None of us did, except for Dorothy, if you count passing out from tequila and horror. We estimated we had about 7 hours until dawn. Kirk argued that everyone who came out was either asleep or celebrating their victory over the tourists back at whatever clubhouse they shared. He wasn't ready to sleep though. We sat in candlelight to get the best view outside the windows. Greg patrolled upstairs for a while and then joined us in the dining room. The doors were open and the screen shut so we could hear anyone gathering out back, but only heard the gentle roll of surf. "If they come back, the lights will go on," Greg said. "If the police drive by and see that rug on the wall, maybe they'll check in." To be honest, we hadn't seen any lights, except that of the moon and the ocean since the gang departed. It was a beautiful scene. To be honest, I tried to relax and have a few Coronas to help, but we told stories of our glory days to keep awake, and even had to shush ourselves from keeping from waking Dorothy. It was around 3 in the morning when the security light out front goes on again. We didn't have the energy to be startled, but responded immediately. I checked the security monitor. It was a couple of people there to collect the ladder and the rug. Pulling the rug down triggered the lights, and they quickly ran off back up the road into the dark. Tiny pixels of light shone in the distance as they switched on flashlights. The rest of the morning remains a fuzzy memory. I may have drifted off, and may have the others, but none of us slept. Sunrise gave us all the confidence, and Keith immediately conspired with Greg and Kirk to power nap before Paula returned to take them on the all-day trip inland. I said we should go to the police and get the phone fixed before the 3 of them left the property in the hands of an exhausted me and already terrified Dorothy. Shortly after dawn, Dorothy came downstairs in a swimsuit, walked past us without a word and walked into the pool. She dunked herself and began fishing stones out from the bottom. I helped Keith make breakfast and things began returning to normal. Keith agreed to postpone the trip until we could file a complaint and get the phone settled. We ate and agreed to ask Paolo to put us in touch with the authorities. When the buzzer sounded again, we all jumped a little, but it was Paolo. We let him into the compound. He was dressed for comfort, ripped jean shorts and an old golf shirt with sandals. We explained the night before and he didn't seem surprised, except for the part about the phone being out. He walked with Keith around the side and confirmed his suspicion that the line had been cut outside the wall. The line could be fixed, but just as easily be cut again. With this done, Keith phoned the owner to let him know what had happened. According to Keith, he feigned concern and promised to use his connections in Cancun and Puerto Juarez to increase police patrols the next night and hand over the security tape to the officers who would come and investigate. Convinced this would solve all our problems, Keith, Kirk and Greg left the house late, but to put in the full day's hours away at the Chichen Itza site. Paolo pulled me aside and handed me a small metal case. He patted me on the shoulder as if confident I'd know what to do with it. Inside was a handgun with 2 magazines. Startled, I took it inside and wiped it down for prints, but I kept it in the kitchen. Dorothy said nothing all day, getting out the pool and showering. She sat on the patio outside the dining room and read a book. When the police showed up 4 hours later, I brought them in and explained everything. One of them spoke English well enough and explained the house we rented had been owned by a local drug trafficker. He wasn't exactly a kingpin, but he was able to keep a nice residence until his life was terminated. It was brought up by a local businessman, but tourists, for some reason, didn't like the idea of being this far away from the protected tourist zone. The kids were probably locals with nothing better to do than harass Americans, and we should relax and have a good time. They didn't even want to see the playback, they just took the VHS tape and wished us well, assuring us that a car would drive by at least once an hour overnight. I didn't mention that a lot could happen in an hour's time. I kept checking the phone line, as if the sudden lack of a dial tone was my first alert for trouble. I thought that if they could cut the phone, they could probably cut the power almost as easily, but I didn't share any of this with Dorothy. I made lunch, but Dorothy didn't want to eat. She didn't want to talk either. She'd sat tensely in the sitting room with her book. I collected the stones from the pool area and piled them by the door. I cleaned out the debris and then spent some hours soothing my nerves with beer, Jimmy Buffett songs, and a network of pool needles serving as a raft. The guys never settled on a time they should return. Paolo said not to even try because they had to drive through the jungle and there might be any number of delays or detours. It was best to be home by sundown, so when the sun fell behind the trees that second night and they had not returned, I started to get concerned. There had been talks of playing a D&D adventure or just some card game that night, so their intention was not to be out too late. Dorothy had taken a nap in the middle of the day, but never went back outside after her swim. She returned to her chair with another book and went right into it. She refused dinner, but I made her something anyway, hoping the smell would just jumpstart her appetite. I felt like a well-treated prisoner. People walked along the road outside the compound, sometimes peering into the upstairs window to catch a glimpse at the tourists. Others lounged on the beach beyond the gate. It was probably safe for us to go out there, but we weren't taking a chance. In the end, the night fell over the house again, and with just Dorothy and me inside it. When the security lights went off again, it was around 8 in the evening. I had drifted off. It was the front side of the house, and I didn't see anyone outside the wall. When I got to the front door and looked out the peephole, I saw one man standing in the yard. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, but I wasn't sure if he was armed. He just stood there in the floor light staring at the front door, then to one side of the unused garage, and then to the downstairs bedroom on the opposite side. Dorothy got up and went to the phone. There was a dial tone, but dialing 911 left her with a dead line. She tried a few more times without success. At that moment, the buzzer sounded. Fearing another attack, I retreated to the security monitors and saw Paolo's cab outside. I buzzed them through. When the gate began to move, the man in the yard fled to the back of the house. It took a while for the car to get inside, and I moved to get the weapon from the case in the kitchen. The man raced to the back gate. As I suspected, it was accessible from the inside, as he threw it open. As he did, about 5 men rushed forwards, only to be stopped by the man inside and motioned to run, which they all did. With the rest of the gang back in the compound, Paolo told us he radioed police when he saw a bunch of creeps outside the wall. They were at the market and were on their way. The 3 men were deeply tanned and a little drunk from their experience, which they promised had a moment similar to the night before. Soon after, the police arrived outside the compound and they interviewed Paolo and the rest of us. They had Polaroids of the people they caught near the marketplace and took our word when we positively identified them as the man in the yard and the others trying to get in. It was all they needed to not only arrest them, but to round up the other kids that harassed us the previous night. Settling in, I returned the weapon to Paolo, but he offered to sell it to me for $50. I can't say if I took him up on it or not, but the rest of us felt a lot safer for the remaining 12 days of our trip. We even took to the beach as a group. It took a while, but Dorothy began to settle in. After 3 nights of no issues, we all slept through the night and had the adventures we'd been dreaming of for 8 years. I've had a few frightening encounters over the span of my life, but nothing quite as intense as one that took place on a night during my senior year of high school. I had been managing the latest in a series of successive breakups with my high school sweetheart, and I was looking for any reason I could find not to sequester myself into my computer room as I so often did. My friend Mia, who lived in a neighboring community, had invited me over to her place to hang out with her and her brother. I was a socially awkward teenager, and Mia being a fairly recent acquaintance, I accepted on the condition that I could bring along a frequent companion of mine, Robert. He was always prepared to hang out, and I could confirm his presence there before even asking him. She was hesitant of bringing another person round, but when I promised her we'd set off some of Robert's fireworks, she agreed. Mia had conditions of her own, stressing the importance of calling her to come pick us up as soon as we arrived at the transit station. I thought it was a bit of an odd request. I had been to Mia's house before, and it was only a short walk from the station. I didn't think to ask her why, as I was just pleased to be going anywhere. "Oh, and you have to bring your fireworks," I told Robert. After grumbling, he gathered up the small cachet that he had stashed under his bed and we headed out. Robert and I arrived at the station around 11, and I did as Mia had instructed. Not expecting an invite that late in the evening, my cell phone was left uncharged, with enough juice to let Mia know that we had arrived. As Robert and I whiled away the time singing 80s tunes in an off-key rhythm, a black SUV with tinted windows came streaming into the parking area next to the station, swerving wildly and honking before it shot off into the suburban community we were heading towards. Mia arrived shortly after, and we made our way towards the schoolyard. Robert was still a bit prickly about wasting the last of his fireworks, which was fairly uncharacteristic of him, as he presented himself as one of the most habitually apathetic people I had ever met up until that point. We had set off a handful of fireworks. A few of them were duds, but most of them did what they were designed for, attracting attention. Another black SUV came barreling down the road by the school a few minutes later. This one had a collection of balloons tied to the interior of the car that flew out a rearview window, battering against one another as the SUV came to a sudden halt. Mia's face held a look of knowing concern that I didn't entirely understand. "I'll be right back," she told us. I held my breath from a distance as I witnessed a figure hop out of the passenger seat of the SUV and approach Mia. I let out a heavy sigh of relief, as their greeting, while out of earshot, was warm. There was a rapport and friendliness not commonly reserved for foreboding strangers you meet, with the hour creeping closer to midnight, and the lights in the surrounding homes growing increasingly scarce. Mia was the type of gal you couldn't help but like. She was bright, funny, talented, and never did much to offend anyone. She treated everyone on equal terms and a natural byproduct of this is collecting friends of every high school archetype. Some of those archetypes were one of the ones I was all too familiar with, the jocks, bullies, and bad seeds, the latter of which her district high school had a notorious reputation for. By that point in my life, I was already content with the knowledge that the flaring tempers between most individuals of every identifiable clique would simmer with age. But there would always be the select few that never quite got over the thrill of illicit dealings and physical violence. Their behavior would escalate, and they'd step into the criminal lifestyle at a young adult, where their actions became less excusable. I was and still am a tiny male at 28 years old, never growing beyond 5'4", and an easy target for such a person. I had the reputation for being a mischievous but laid-back slacker who could take a punch but couldn't throw one, and I relied on the former trait to diffuse tension between situations outside my tribe. It didn't always work, but it allowed me to skate by relatively unharmed for most of my high school career. Mia embraced the stranger in a hug before they parted ways. The stranger got back into the SUV and peeled off. When she returned, I asked her what that was all about. That was a friend of mine from St. Francis High. They're out celebrating his buddy's 18th birthday and driving around and beating the crap out of people walking by themselves. You're alright if you're with me, but I think we should probably head back to my place. Fine by me. I'd rather not be party to some kid's twisted adulthood initiation rites as he proves his machismo to his buddies while they take turns packing my face in. We arrived to Mia's house, but the mood had turned pretty sour and contemplative as we sat with very little to discuss aside from the obvious. We got about 20 minutes into a movie before Mia's father walked in. Mia, it's 12. Time to say goodnight to your friends. Mia explained the situation, but being an honest student with overly invested parents can sometimes mean bearing the burden of strict rules. One, being in bed by 12. The other, no safe harboring for teenaged boys overnight. Christ, what had we gotten ourselves into? Mia told us that there were 4 of the SUVs driving around. She asked us to be safe before saying goodbye and locking the door behind her. Robert and I slowly walked off the porch and into the cul-de-sac. A disappointing evening, but it happens. I took my cell phone from my pocket to trouble my best friend for a ride, but had forgotten that I didn't charge it earlier and the battery had since died. Robert didn't bother to carry a cell phone with him and communicated with the few people he did hang out with over MSN Messenger. We took inventory of what we had left with us before taking off towards the transit station. My pockets were virtually empty, save for my wallet. Robert had a single remaining firework in his possession, along with his Zippo lighter. There was a house down the street that I recalled was being renovated, with one of those industrial-shaped disposal bins out front. I leapt inside, and re-emerged hefting a 2x4 with a few nails bent into it. Robert laughed at the visual. Call me Buford Pusser Jr. I am walking small, I cracked. Robert had his Zippo and a firework at the ready. I'll shoot this in their face, he said. It sounded as if we were in high spirits. It's because the risk of our situation hadn't quite sunken in yet. We were aware that the transit station would be shutting relatively soon, and the train wouldn't be any help, and this particular station held the final terminal on the line, but the buses might still be active. The neighborhood we had started in had enough walkways, bike lanes, and tree cover that we could sink our way through the shadows for a while. We took our time choosing the most secluded and unlit passageways, which in hindsight I realized did nothing to help our nerves. At one point we came up to an intersecting walkway that we were familiar with in the daytime. The passageway ahead of us was lit overhead by a single yellow streetlight, before fading into the yawning mouth of pitch darkness. We stood there, agonizing for several minutes over whether or not we should find another route or stay the course, listening for any sound of movement on the other side. We briefly contemplated camping out for the remainder of the night before opting for another detour. The night's silence was punctuated every so often by the squealing of tires, shouting, or the sudden acceleration of a vehicle. Then we reached the main road. Not only one of the main roads in the area, but one of the main roads in our end of town. From there on there was little cover, nothing but houses, buildings, and a large empty parking lot, all illuminated by streetlights that, at that moment, felt more like the halogen floodlights they shine on escaped prisoners as they rush across the yard to freedom. There was little traffic at this point in the night, so if one of the SUVs did come down the road, we would not go unnoticed, and there'd be virtually nothing to stop them from doing what they were intending to do. We listened for any sign of obnoxious motors revving before we took off across the road and into the parking lot. Less than a minute later, we arrived at the transit station. We quickly checked the posted bus times, but as indicated by the digital clock outside, all the buses had made their final run. We hopped into the shelter in the train terminal, but the doors had already been locked. We'd have to stick to the main road until we made it to the bus trap. The bus trap was our safe haven. What's unique to this bus trap is that it was right under a tightly constructed underpass that divides one community from another. After years of drivers still risking the odds to make their trip shorter, the underpass had been fitted with added precautions, cement blockades, and a metal gate that only opened for buses. This would increase our chances of making a clean getaway if the birthday boy and his pals sped towards us. Robert and I flinched to every distant sound, unaware of whether it was an ordinary motorist on their way home after a late evening, or the assailants we were so concerned with running into. We began to think that maybe we were overreacting. There was a good chance that someone had already phoned the police on them, and they had taken off to another area to avoid detection. Maybe they'd gone home, or better yet, gotten arrested. We let our guard slip as we reached our old junior high, starting to think that the worst case scenario we were preparing for was already behind us. That I was carrying a cumbersome piece of wood only looked like a jackass, that Robert was still armed with a firework and his Zippo for nothing. This is where I remember the set of walkways leading straight through the community towards an elementary school which was right by the bus trap. I had walked it plenty of times before, and with the streetlights spaced out every 60 feet, we'd see them from a mile away, but they'd see us too. What we were greeted with instead were long expanses of burnt-out streetlight, another sparsely lit tunnel of shadows, and nightmares. We started down the path, because what other choice did we really have? Robert flicked his Zippo open as much as he could, still careful to conserve his lighter fluid in case of an actual confrontation. The walk didn't last long. The oversensitive backlight porches helped to fill in dark points, but there reached a point where it was getting too dark, where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and the accompanying sound of snapping twigs and branches was enough to signify that we might want to just get the hell out of there. We stood paralyzed for a moment, imagining the birthday boy and his friends waiting behind the shadow to pummel us. Though, sensing it had just been an animal, we returned to the quieter neighborhood areas. There may be more room for us to be seen, but less risk of getting cornered. We quickly made our way along unfamiliar streets and joined up with the final walkway to see it. The elementary school, and in the distance, the bus trap. We were so relieved to see safety in our sights, walking at a relaxed pace and feeling foolish for turning a 20-minute walk into an hour-long ordeal. We passed through the elementary school grounds and began walking the fully lit streets down the bus trap, when a black SUV came whipping around the corner on the left-hand side nearest the bus trap, balloons from the rear window streaking backwards from the velocity as the vehicle accelerated. There's no way they didn't see us. Crap, I shouted at Robert as we doubled back towards the elementary school and rounded the corner. We both had to think fast, as the road they were on was only a 15-second drive at the speed they were doing. We ran down the street along the elementary school but found no cover. I heard the engine grow closer to us within seconds of turning into the street. We were out of time, and I pointed to the only cover I could find, a side yard fence. No accompanying front fence, no attaching hedge, nothing. Robert and I lied down on the grass against the fence, long like boards and stiff as corpses, our respective weapons at the ready. I have never felt my heart pump as hard as it was at that moment, tightly gripping the 2x4 while I watched Robert position the firework and unclap the Zippo. As if this was going to do anything, we really were chumps. The SUV slowed to a roll as it turned the corner, the headlights reaching down the road as they were searching for us. Convinced they wouldn't find us in the car, they parked. They parked at the edge of the property, right next to us. The headlights of the SUV were peeking out just beyond the fence. We were beyond screwed. 4 doors popped open, and within a few seconds, each to each other, feet kicking up gravel as the birthday gang murmured to one another and began to search for us. I noted at least 4 sets of footsteps and a couple of indistinct voices. We were definitely outnumbered. My mind flashed through all the numerous times I'd been pushed about at school, laughing good-naturedly as I refused to fight back in futility. I knew everyone who did this to me, and this humanized me to them enough that they never pushed it too far. These people didn't know me. They weren't aware of the bullshit persona I assumed. The odd guy who was alright with pain. They didn't know I pretended to think I was funny. These guys wanted to hurt me. They wanted to hurt me and my friend. This is it, I thought. This is the moment you quit being such a coward and you earn your own respect. I gripped the 2x4 tightly enough to dig tiny wooden splinters into my hand, and just listened to my heart thump as my blood boiled with whatever rage I could summon. I would only have a slim opportunity to surprise them before they'd take us down, and I hoped that Robert would get his firework off soon enough to buy us some time. If I was only getting in one strike, I was going to make sure it connected. As if some force miraculously knew what we were up against, I heard a voice say, "Screw it." A few seconds later, the car doors slammed shut. The SUV backed up, pulled a U-turn and drove off. All the courage I had to muster, everything I was prepared to fight with in a losing battle that I never knew my body had in me, and it all slowly settled back into the deepest regions of myself. Robert and I walked the quiet back route to the bus trap. We arrived at the underpass and casually walked through it. We both took a moment to look back into the other community that we had spent so much of our time in without issue, now in recognition of what we just had narrowly avoided. It felt like the type of thing a person should do. I wish I could say this near brush had some transformative effect on me, that it forced me to re-examine my passive tendencies and open up a new chapter in my life where I stopped letting myself be treated like everyone else's ragdoll. It didn't, not necessarily. My one takeaway from this experience was, despite my many previous assumptions about my fight or flight response, it proved that in a rare moment when I'm backed into a corner, I'll be prepared to stand my ground. Until then, birthday gang, let's not meet again. This happened at the last house my mother's sister and I were renting in. The house had changed hands every year or so, and it belonged to a renting company rather than a regular landlord, so we didn't have any information about the previous residents of the place, but it was in a decent neighborhood, so we didn't think it necessary to check. About 8 months after moving in, last January, I was playing video games in the office on a Saturday night, at around midnight or so, when I was startled by an aggressively loud banging on the front door. The rapping was so hard it sounded like the door would fly off at its hinges, and it echoed through the entire house, loud enough that my mother could hear it in her room with the door closed and with music on. Now, we all know that it's never a good thing when someone bangs on your door that hard in the middle of the night, but that didn't stop my mother from racing downstairs and beating me to the door to see what the hell was happening, and answered it by pulling the blinds from the windows next to the door, revealing a man who looked to be in his mid-20s standing very close to it. When she asked him what was going on, he replied he was looking for someone named Jamal. Nobody knew a guy with that name, so she told them nobody was there. The guy kept persisting, and my mother continued to insist that the person they were looking for didn't live here. After a few minutes, my mother would later tell me that there was another guy who appeared from the left coming around from the side of the house, where some windows were, and it became very clear he was checking for Jamal, in case my mother was lying or something. Thankfully, they eventually left. The next morning, I took out our car to drive to work, and noticed it wasn't driving right, as I was sliding all around the lane. I didn't pay it too much mind, however, because it snowed a few days prior and there was still ice on the road in some places, so I assumed there was a lot of black ice. It wasn't until someone in the parking lot of the store I worked at flagged me down and told me 2 of my tires were losing air and flatting out. I carefully drove back home and told my mother what happened with the tires, and it finally clicked. The angry knocking at midnight, the aggressive demanding for a guy we didn't know, the guy scouting around the side of the house, likely looking in windows. They slashed all our tires, which meant they were likely armed. The thought of them not believing us and breaking in still haunts me to this day, because we wouldn't have had a way to fight back if they chose to keep looking. It's the first time I've ever felt completely helpless. A few weeks later, we got a package for someone who was a previous tenant, and a guy came looking for it, after assuming it was delivered to their old residence. Turns out, the guy was Jamal's older brother. We told him what happened, and he seemed completely blindsided by the information, as if that was the first time he'd learnt that his little brother may be involved in the wrong crowd. I don't know what happened afterwards, but hopefully the revelation led to Jamal getting help. We also got some free tires out the deal, so it wasn't a total loss, but I'd rather not see those 2 guys ever again, especially in the middle of the night. My family is from Hungary. We are currently residing in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. Here crime is crazy high. I remember that Mike Pondsmith once called Rio the most cyberpunk city in the world, because he read about these cases where police were fighting some cartel that used rocket launchers against them. I live in a pretty expensive neighborhood, but I can hear someone shooting, be it pistols, revolver, or rifle, every day. I've been in a war before, and here it's very similar. The police climb up the slums and leave the perished ones on the streets. The cartels burn people alive and so on. That's pretty much a lightweight situation in the city. There are many more aspects which I could touch that aren't pertinent to our story. Even though we dress fairly simply, speak Portuguese with no accent, and don't go walking around, one look at me or my father and you know we're foreigners. So there was this one time, he was driving a company car alone, going to the docks to take a look at some containers with equipment that the company shipped to Brazil because of some big negotiation. When I say father dressed simply, I mean really simply. A short-sleeved shirt, linen pants and shoes, and an old watch that belonged to my grandfather. And that's it. No fancy suits or anything when it wasn't strictly necessary. It just so happened he was driving in a dangerous area. Too many trees and all. He fell for the oldest trick in the book. A boy of 12 or 13 in the middle of the street lying down. No space to turn, so he stopped. That's when 5 thugs came out of the bushes with guns. I sincerely doubt it was a real pistol the way he described them. They looked more like greenhorns in the business than anything else. Everyone was nervous when they came into the car. They looked into the glove compartment and found nothing, and told my father to drive to the bank. They all entered the bank with my father and made him empty something like €1,000, which is money considering we aren't rich. No idea why the guards didn't do anything, but thinking better, perhaps it was for the best. If that pistol really was a pistol, that would have turned into a standoff with the police, and a hostage situation in Rio usually turns into showdowns. They made him drive to a slum and took the car. Father was lucky, unscathed, other than a bruise that the gun dude made by whipping his head. Moral of the story? Father went to the police and explained the situation. Police have some kind of veneration for foreigners, and he was wounded. The bank refunded the money, and from the 6, as far as I know, they didn't enjoy it for very long. Police got 4 of them, including Pistol Dude and the boy, as they weren't able to scrap the car for parts. They had to burn it. 1 was wounded and apprehended, but passed away like the other 4. He was a minor, as were 2 others of the fallen. Another regular day in Rio, sadly. Rewind this time to the year 2002. I was in a residential nationwide high school, which is in Washington, D.C. And everyone knows that D.C., or any other major city, can be dangerous. I was invited to visit one of my friends' home for spring break. I met with some local students, and they were all cute. They invited me on a night out with them, and one of the boys borrowed his mum's van, wanting to go cruising around Phoenix to show me the sights. I was the only girl in the group of boys. There were 9 of us hunkered down in an old Dodge white van. One of the guys had a brilliant idea of doing drive-by egg throws, so they bought eggs and kept the van door open as they tossed eggs at pedestrians. This wasn't what got us into trouble. After all of our dozen eggs were tossed, we shut the van door and were getting ready to go home. This is when it hit the fan. I was sitting in the back of the van. We were at a red light. Then a silver Honda Accord pulled alongside us, and I saw 2 men in the car. They kept looking at us. Immediately, one of them rolled down the window and actually showed us his firearm, and was saying something that I couldn't understand. The light turned green. The boy driving his mother's white Dodge van tried unsuccessfully to dart ahead or even dodge, and that wasn't happening with 9 school students in a van. We were chased by the silver Honda Accord. We tried slowing down and speeding up, making quick turns, but to no luck. Their Honda Accord was able to keep up easily, and it wasn't helping that the streets were empty. We accidentally ended up cornering ourselves in when we pulled into a water reservoir entrance that had a dead end. The 2 guys came out their Honda, their headlights shining in our eyes, and they had weapons. They each had 2, and were using bandanas on their shaved heads. They were surprised how many people came out the van, and even more surprised that we were all deaf and were signing. They realized that we weren't throwing up gang signs at them. Then they said, "My bad," and just left. For once, being deaf saved my life. So dudes in bandanas and Honda Accords that are in Phoenix, Arizona, let's not ever meet. Also, do not throw eggs at people. We were in high school and stupid. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's tales. If of course you did, don't forget to let me know in the regular place. As always, I would like to extend a huge thank you to all my wonderful patrons who help keep the channel alive by supporting with a little bit every month. If you do this, your name goes on the end credits, as you see now, as well as a host of other perks for signing up. In any case, if you would like to sign up, you can check out the link in the description, and obviously it means a lot. Thanks guys. If anything creepy or scary has ever happened to you, feel free to send it to my email or my Reddit page, both of which can be found in the description, and you may see it soon in a future video. But for now guys, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.